Welcome, everyone. I'm really excited. I'm really honored to be able to talk to the group and quite a diverse group we have here from different locations around the world. So we're today going to talk about, and I'm hoping you had a chance to see some of the emails that went out just to get a sense of the themes we're talking about. But the title is our Reconnecting with Our Collective Metabolism and Composting Our Material and Affective Shit. And it's a Zoom call, so we likely won't be able to compost much as we're on the call, but kind of preparing us for future work that we can do together and in our own locations. So I'm Will Valley, and Teresa will introduce herself in a minute, and we'll just jump right in. So a bit about me. I'm an Irish-Scottish heritage, and I'm fourth generation settler in what's currently called Canada. But I was born and raised in interior Salish territory, the Okanagan tribe in the Sail Nation. So it's currently known as Penticton, Summerland area. Just highlighting this, two quick reasons. One, for me, in my process, my journey of emerging, I identify as a heterosexual, cisgendered white man. And so it took me a bit longer in this journey to kind of shake free of some of the oppressive blinders that I inherited and I still have. But it was this particular land, this dry grassland ecosystem, the ponderosa pine, the antelope brush. We have some amazing wildflowers. The land for me was what helped push me out of my own white supremacy. Well, I'm still in a white supremacist society and a state of being, but it helped push me out. And it's also a very dry land area. It's Canada's only desert. And that's the dryness I'm going to come back to in a second. So that's kind of where I was born and raised, but I'm currently I'm on the traditional ancestral and unceded homelands of the Musqueam, Squamish, and Tsleil-Waututh nations in this wet, temperate rainforest ecosystem, which is Vancouver, a lovely spot as well to live. So I've been here for about 20 years now, fully transitioned in minor politics of British Columbia. You've got Vancouver, and then the rest of the province is how we kind of set up our identities in a way. So I went from the rest of the province, and now I'm a Vancouver person. So I'm a little bit of a mix there. I used to be an elementary and high school teacher, predominantly natural sciences, although to be honest, I would teach anything to get paid. So I've taught French, math, PE. But currently, I'm employed as an associate professor of teaching in the Faculty of Land and Food Systems at the University of British Columbia. And that's how I came to meet Vanessa and Sharon and Cash and all the folks and Renee and the gesturing towards decolonial futures. My current field of study and teaching, sustainable food systems education. It's a bit of a niche within kind of like agriculture, nutritional science, food science realms. I look at food literacy, food security, food insecurity, food sovereignty, and food justice, and increasingly looking at how we can develop and cultivate equity competencies for our students within this realm of kind of natural sciences. And the last part, over the past few years, I've been gesturing towards decolonial futures with the collective and learning from the collective, and feel really honored to be a part of these conversations and this work. So I'm going to pass it over quickly to Terry to tell you a little bit about herself.
Hello, everyone. Well, I just came from a journey trying to meet my colleagues and friends, educators around Central and Eastern Europe, talking about what are these times bringing to us, and trying to move through the space despite and in the midst of all the restrictions. So here's just a very brief intro. I was born in Czechoslovakia, and right now I'm sitting in the Czech Republic. And as a doctoral student at UBC, I've been as well hosted at the traditional ancestral and unceded territory of the Musqueam people. And my main field of exploration as a facilitator and educator has been what we call in Europe a global education trying to explore different ways how to understand our aim of collectively acting in a different way towards some different future than the one that has been violent and colonial over centuries. So far my main field of research were focusing a lot in the field of food systems, food justice, climate justice, and the global change and paradigm change in general. So as a member of the collective, I'm looking forward to this session together with Will and your wisdom, looking at the metabolizing potential of our composting work.
Perfect. Thank you, Terry. All right, so today's objectives, these are mainly for me to keep me on track. I have a tendency to, I just love tangents. They're just my favorite thing. So for your benefit, I'm trying to keep myself within the relative straight and narrow. So today it's really about connecting key conceptual dimensions of the gesturing towards decolonial future frameworks and some of the frameworks and cartographies that support what we're doing and what we're trying to achieve in this collective, and relate them to the processes of decomposition and composting. And I'm going to specifically focus on the four denials and the house that modernity built. So hopefully you're familiar with those, because I'm not going to spend too much time unpacking them, although in our discussion it'd be lovely to get into it, but I'm not going to spend too much time explaining and unpacking, although they are quite complex. But it's more about those are the fundamentals and showing how it relates to decomposition and composting. And the second is together, hopefully, because brings me to the limits of my experiences, my understanding, is how we can explore and extend this metaphor of composting, material composting, towards composting our affective shit, which, to the best of my knowledge, is that it's a new term, new field, new approach. Although there are millennia of wisdom out there about this process, but thinking about how to extend these two metaphors. And then I'm going to bring up a recent kind of cartography of compost. So it's in all caps, not that we're shouting, but it represents, each letter represents a new kind of condition for possibly metabolizing our affective shit. So those are the two main objectives. I'm hoping at the end of the session, though, that you'll see, or you'll gather, or we'll have an opportunity to critique and play around with some useful pedagogical tools towards, I'd say, mainly intellectually dismantling, although we are going to try and bring in some affective activities, to dismantling some modern colonial habits of mind, and potentially I'm hoping some useful pedagogical tools that might help us share and collectively dismantle the house that modernity built as well. And so sometimes, because there's that recent article or article put up in opendemocracy.net, prepared by the group and authors within the call. So sometimes I'll be referring to direct quotes from this Open Democracy, Preparing for the End of the World as We Know It. And one of the statements in there that really resonated with what we're going to talk about is that I see composting and the understanding of decomposition as a source of vitality, joy, serenity, and collective well-being that centers our relationships and responsibility to one another, including to the earth itself. So for me, why I love food, although I wouldn't say I identify as a foodie, but why I love food and composting is, for me, it's a daily reminder of the sacred. It is one of our, for me, it's one of the easiest ways in the pedagogical sense and with conversation with others to explicitly state that we all are connected to the sacred, regardless of where we are, through that process of transformation of bringing something from the external world, from the metabolism of the land, into our bodies, and then that thing becomes us. And for me, it gives me kind of like shivers and goosebumps every time I think about that process of the food you consume becoming you. And it's undeniable. Very few people could have a rational, even an emotional argument that says, no, that's not true. But at the other end as well, the other end in terms of our shit and what we're composting is as beautiful as the act of eating in my mind. So I want to show today a little bit about how we can view composting as a sacred act and how it relates to connecting us to our broader metabolism. And bringing kind of part of just kind of connecting to other thought leaders in the area. There's this great quote, although my Zoom is kind of, here we go. Great quote that came up from another recent presentation that has been shared amongst the group, the Gesturing Towards Decolonial Futures group. And it's from Sherry Mitchell. And she talks about, we need to be able to shift our thinking away from acts of conquest to really addressing the illusion of separation in our minds, so that we can instead transcend our differences, cycle forward together, integrate what works, and let go of what doesn't, move forward as a whole. And for me, this is really what understanding decomposition and composting can do for us. And fundamental to it, I think a fundamental embracing and understanding of decomposition hits at that target of the illusion of separation. So we'll come back to this key moment of separation, that this ontological belief of separation that is so fundamental to the house of modernity and some of the denials we see in this work. So that's this will, because I have a natural science background. So I just want to say that most of this will be in that intellectual domain of understanding some issues of separation and the house modernity built, but we are going to try and bring in some affective dimensions through our opening and closing activities. And why is that important? Because among this group, we're often emphasizing that this isn't the change we're looking to see isn't just about a change in thinking. We have enough information, we have rational arguments. They have limits in terms of what the change we want to actually see. So we need to start developing more habits of being with deeper affective, relational, and neurobiological dimensions, including hopes, desires, and unconscious attachments, compulsions, and projections that cannot be interrupted by the intellect alone. So although today I will be intellectualizing a lot of this, we are trying to bring in some dimensions that get towards that affective domain and that affective change that we know is necessary. So let's jump into one. And if you got the email, there was a bit of a disclaimer. So this particular activity we're going to do for the next 10 minutes is, well, if you're familiar with practice of yoga, shavasana, essentially. So corpse pose, thinking about being a corpse and decomposing depending on your yoga studio and your yoga practice. Sometimes shavasana is offered as a way to relax or to reconnect and regenerate, which is all true. We're going to approach it as a way to think about, and I hope folks on the call it won't be too overwhelming. We're going to consider our own deaths. It's something we should do quite often, and so we're going to do it collectively today through this activity. So if you have a place to lie down, that's ideal. It's hard to imagine your own death sitting up, although some people do it. So at this moment, I'll invite you to find a nice, comfortable place to lie down, perhaps not too comfortable, because if you're like me in a yoga practice and you fall asleep during shavasana and start snoring, it can get a bit embarrassing. We won't judge you, but find a nice place to lie down. If you can still hear my voice, and I'll put the timer on. I'm going to walk you through some imagery to help us reconnect to what will eventually happen to us all, which is decomposition and a reconnection to our broader metabolism. So let's see my screen. Trying to get a sense here. Yeah, so I want you to find a spot. How can I see this here? All right. It looks like everyone's found a nice spot. I can't see most people on the screen. So find a place to lie down to feel comfortable. And we're just going to start with a bit of breath work just to reconnect. And so I'm going to ask you to breathe in and count to 3 as you breathe in. So 1, 2, 3. Hold it for 2. And then breathe out for 5. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. And we'll repeat this a few times. So breathe in and hold for 2 and breathe out. 4 and 5. Do this for a few more breaths. While you're breathing, just try to settle in and let your body connect to the mat, connect to the carpet, the floor, the earth, the pad of moss you found, and keep on breathing in for a few more cycles. And at this moment, if you haven't already, I recommend closing your eyes and thinking about the weight of your body, starting with your toes, starting to travel towards your ankles, and your ankles, if they're connecting to the surface, the flat area, to your calf muscles, traveling up your legs, your thighs, your buttocks, your lower back. Maybe you can feel your spine getting up into your shoulders, feeling some tensions, noticing where there are some hot spots, some loose spots, some tingly spots. Traveling up to your neck, to the back of your neck, and the back of your head, the back of your skull, and all the way to the little tip at the top. And really feel the weight and the pressure of the atmosphere as a blanket, as a comforting presence, kind of holding you down, and also the weight and the comfort of whatever you're lying on pushing back. We always have these two opposing forces. So the atmosphere is pushing down on us, the earth is pulling up as well, and kind of letting your body just gently settle in. And again, always noticing if you're focusing on certain areas, notice and let go, get to the next notice, and then get to the next let go. And start thinking about what is going on towards the end of our lives, the moment where our vital energy escapes and ends. And start thinking about the weight of the atmosphere, the weight of the land, and the comfort in pulling you in. And I want you to direct your attention towards the imagery of what will happen to your flesh. And some traditions have different ways of dealing with dead bodies, corpses, fire, in boxes, not connected to the earth. For this particular experience, let's imagine that we are connected to the soil. We're in the earth and we're being visited. And we get visited by our friends in the community, the decomposers. And so our flesh, our muscles will be decomposed. And this, hopefully, at this moment, this isn't an anxiety-inducing sensation or imagery as much as a comfort, a release, and a recognition that will be redistributed within this community. And so as our flesh decomposes and as we're redistributed into the bodies and the cell membranes of bacteria and fungi and the invertebrates that visit us, they help redistribute our material cells back into a broader metabolism, back into a broader community throughout an ecosystem. And they travel and they die and they re-release and they recycle. And so at a certain point, it becomes obvious that what we are attached to as us, as we have to stop making those claims. They're not taking away a part of you. It never really was a part of you only. It was always a temporary manifestation of the nutrients, of the energy, of the metabolism of the earth. And so picture yourself dissolving, contributing, participating, traveling, going from the lower trophic levels into the higher levels, being picked up, being decomposed, being eaten, being transferred, eventually into the trees, into the water, into other life forms, into the soil. So this practice of Shavasana, or corpse pose, is really about recognizing the impermanence of life, recognizing that something that in some societies is considered the most sacred or even the most important unit of society, the self, is really an illusion. It's a temporary manifestation. It's a useful illusion, but an illusion nonetheless. And thinking through the feeling of dissolving, being supported, being reintegrated by the community of decomposers, and reconnecting to the metabolism of the earth that we've always been connected to, but now in a different form. We'll leave about another 1 minute or so just to lie in and sense that feeling. For me, it's a feeling of joy and serenity. Also be aware of what this feeling is, what the affect is emerging for you. But I'll leave about a minute or so of silence to experience the process of disintegration. All right, I'm going to get you to slowly come back, to open your eyes, to notice how you're feeling, notice your breath. Take a few more breaths in. And it'll take about 10-15 seconds to slowly come up, then return back to our Zoom world. I see most faces reappearing. Hopefully we haven't lost anyone. Although experiencing this by lying down would be also lovely too, so I don't take it personally. So for me, this opportunity to rethink, it's a simple activity, but a simple opportunity to rethink that sense of self, and not in a way to refute the idea that we don't have selves. Of course we do, and it's a useful model, but not all models. The models are always a representation, a limited representation of reality, and we don't need to wait until we're dead to experience the decomposition, to experience the reconnection to our land and the metabolism in which we are connected. As I said before, when we eat, eating is dying and dying is eating. As we're eating, depending on, think about what you had for breakfast or lunch or dinner, you have taken a structure that's full of energy and process and decomposed through the mechanical decomposition and then the chemical decomposition, and taken what that was and then reintegrated into yourself. So we're always a part of of the greater metabolism, and the dual processes of eating and dying are, for me, very direct ways that we can bring attention to our communities, to whomever we're engaging with, to think through some of these fundamental beliefs of separation. I want to, before we jump into some of the work from the Gesturing Towards Decolonial Futures Collective, I just want to take a step back and relate this to another field that I'm involved in, or some of the field that we bring into our teaching, and it's around kind of complexity theory and systems thinking. And for me, because I'm often trying to think about how to translate what I'm learning and experiencing in the Gesturing Towards Decolonial Future Collective and their activities back to the audience that I mostly engaged with, involved with in the natural sciences. I'm always looking for this overlap and ways to communicate and bridge and to bring folks towards these understandings. And for me, what you experienced and the process of decomposition that occurred in your mind as you thought through what will happen to your body eventually, and even if there's a process of cremation or mummification, we all eventually, our material cells do redissolve. It's just a matter of time into the land metabolism. And so what we're describing here, though, are structures called dissipative structures. So you and I are dissipative structures. And it's a fascinating way of seeing from a complexity theory side what's going on, a way of describing reality, another way of describing reality. And I'm not saying this is the most accurate way. It's just another way of describing and thinking about what life represents and how it's structured. So dissipative structures are systems that are nonlinear, and a nonlinear system is a system that a linear system. When you have a linear system, a small input gets a small response, larger input, larger response. Nonlinear systems, the quantity of the input doesn't necessarily relate in a quantity of output. And that kind of describes a lot of the systems that we're engaging with, systems in the natural world. Self-organizing and generating, and the key here is far from equilibrium. So you and I and many structures that we engage with and many structures that we understand to be associated with life are far from equilibrium, which means they require material and energy input to exist, to maintain their self-organizing structures. Oops. So this requiring the flow to sustain these structures, and these structures are seen as functional networks. So what this is really describing is a metabolism. So seeing ourselves and seeing our world not as static entities or static systems or static networks, but really as dynamic, far from equilibrium metabolisms that have a current form right now. But that when we think about the structure and the networks that are being sustained, we really need to think about the energy flows and the material flows that come in, as well as the material flows that come out. So our inputs and our outputs. And I have a citation here. It's a quick little read. It's about 12 pages or so from Fritjof Capra, a physicist who is well known in the systems theory. He has a nice paper about the complexity in life and how seeing dissipative structures helps us better understand and make sense of life and metabolism. And for me, that really helps me connect what we talk about when we talk about the land metabolism and the ontological belief of separateness. This complexity theory really points us towards the limitations and the fantasies of believing in separability. And so what we were imagining for our own bodies is the stopping of that flow, the stopping of the energy and material that comes into our structures, that maintain our structures, and what happens next. So when that flow stops, the structure of the network ends, and that's where decomposition begins. We're always in some ways decomposing. Our bodies are always, cells in our bodies are dying, and processes are, but we have this self-generating process based on the energy we bring in to maintain our structure. But when the flow stops, we stop, our material form, and we decompose. Pardon me for that. And so this is where the complexity theory, I think, could benefit from broader understandings beyond the natural sciences, because they talk about when the flow stops, the components return to chaos. And I think this group would have a fun time in a discussion describing how the implications of calling the return to the land metabolism chaos, and what are the entitlements and beliefs that are created by that term. But this is what the complexity theory talks about. So we go from our structures that are dissipative structures, and when the flow of energy, the metabolism ends, there's that return to chaos. So just see if I can play this quick video just to give you a glimpse of, although we had the internal visual in our minds, we can do a quick little visual of what this process of decomposition looks like for fruit and vegetables. Jumping ahead a bit. All right. So for that, just to notice that what we often see as structure and form is based on a material energy flow. And part of, if you had the opportunity to put in a jar some organic matter that had a certain structure and form, and allowing the inevitable process of reconnecting to the metabolism through yeast, through bacteria, through invertebrates. You saw there a ton of flies coming and helping decompose. That is the fundamental process, excuse me, of a metabolism that we can visualize and we can experience and we can connect to folks' everyday lives. And for me, it's really important to bring that process in and the visuals in a way to then set us up for talking about what I think are some of the fundamentals of the Gesturing Towards Decolonial Futures project, which are the 4 denials and the house that modernity built. So I'm quickly going to go through these, and then we will get it. I'd love to hear hold some space for some discussion on this. So first, just reminding you with the 4 denials that can severely restrict the capacity of those of us socialized within modern colonial descent, relate, and imagine otherwise. And so denials of the systemic violence and complicity and harm, so the fact that our comforts, securities, and enjoyments are subsidized by expropriation and exploitation somewhere else. The denial of the limits of the planet, the fact that the planet cannot sustain exponential growth and consumption. The denial of our entanglement, and this one in particular, our insistence in seeing ourselves as separate from each other and the land, rather than entangled within a living, wider metabolism that is biointelligent. And the last denial is the depth and the magnitude of the problems we face. So I'm hoping already you're recognizing the connections between decomposition and these four denials, and how understanding the process of decomposition, exploring, experiencing, and embodying it through activities like Shavasana in a guided way can really start chipping away at some of these denials. And to continue on to the house that modernity built, and this is from the paper that from 2017, Sharon and Dallas and Renee and Vanessa composed, and a few others have been writing about the house that modernity built within the group. But at the foundation of the house that modernity built is the idea of the ontological belief, the way of seeing the world that puts separability at the foundation of all other elements of this house. So the separability is considered a foundation because it enables the production of categories and modes of valuation and measurement that divide, separate, and create the world as we know it inside the house, thereby foreclosing other possibilities. So this fundamental ontological view of reality that's premised on separability as a truth is really what allows these other elements of the house that modernity built to exist. So if you think about what the Enlightenment has brought us, the idea of objectivity and measurement through empiricism and positivism, if you think about reductionism and whose knowledge matters, Rene Descartes being one of the individuals who's most, one of the white men who's often associated with the foundation of Enlightenment, that mind-body dualism. So that belief in separation is fundamental to the types of knowledge that has been developed and used in many violent, harmful ways through the Enlightenment. The same as the nation state. So last year, when we were crossing from Alberta into Montana, Chief Keith Moon talked about the imaginary line, and the imaginary line that has been, to put it politely, he said a burr in his side and for his side of his ancestors for a long time. And the nation state, without this belief of separability, without this belief in the ability to separate, really doesn't exist. These imaginary boundaries, the imaginary borders, and then the consequences of law and order, the idea of sovereignty and the ability to give rights to others and to take away rights from other people is fundamentally based on separability. And then the same with the global capitalism, so the idea of commodification, of alienation, of separating workers from the outputs of their work, but also the idea that we can commodify and trade in a way that's rational, makes sense, and in some ways is part of the water we drink and the air we breathe, is all fundamentally based on separability. So what I like about understanding decomposition, and soon we'll get into composting, as well as the dissipative structure, is it really helps intellectually understand the limits and the contradictions and the fantasies that are part of the house that modernity built and some of the denials that we talked about on the other slide. So extending that metaphor of the dissipative structure, so the idea that we ourselves, as well as life, is far from equilibrium, it makes us recognize that the house that modernity built isn't just limited to the house and the structure. It's actually predicated on the energy flow and the metabolism of violence that allows the house itself to exist. So if we step back from looking at the house that modernity built, we can look at the inputs that are required to keep this house as an actual structure and network. So we can start thinking about and bringing our students or bringing our other folks in our networks to questioning what are the inputs that are required to maintain this structure, because the structure is a dissipative structure, just like our bodies, and it requires input and it has outputs as well. So we can start thinking about what are the conditions that allow this house to even exist. And again, that fundamental condition of separability is one of the is the foundation to this understanding of the house modernity built. So that's why I like seeing decomposition as that pedagogical tool to help us sense, relate, and imagine otherwise. So first off, countering that ontological fantasy of separability and denial of entanglement. So once we recognize ourselves as dissipative structures that are temporarily of a certain form that require energy and material input, but will return back to the metabolism, we're starting to make some cracks into that fundamental belief of what allows the house of modernity to exist. And so another quote from the paper is quoting Moten, is the need to really focus on releasing the fantasy of discrete individual selves. And so the first part is really saying that this isn't easy, to give up this normative conception of subjecthood and citizenship. And you say, I'm not talking about relinquishing a self that you have. I'm talking about relinquishing a fantasy of self, a fantasy of fullness. It's not losing something that you have. It's disavowing or relinquishing the desire for that thing. So by bringing by having us deeply interrogate the idea of the self as a real thing, helps us understand how the house that modernity built and some of the denials that we've talked about are fundamental fantasies and are limiting and need to be addressed both in our classrooms and beyond, so we can start thinking about different futures. And the second part of this is articulating the house as a dissipative structure, as I mentioned, allows us to think about what are the inputs. If we're recognizing the inputs that allow the house to exist as a dissipative structure, we can start thinking about and being strategic about how we interrupt and disrupt those flows, be the material flows, energy flows, or habits of mind that really create this structure and the power of the house of modernity. I want to get to a discussion. So, well, it's important, and it's a bit from the text here, but this also touches upon recognizing that the toxic nature of the house of modernity and what the resources that it extracts and the violences it builds upon is also a positive feedback loop. So thinking through this, understanding the flow of energy and how that reinforces the structure is a really important part of understanding how we can dismantle the house of modernity built. And this, if you're from Canada and you have a television, you'll recognize this man, Mike Holmes, always emphasizing that you need a strong foundation. So for any house. So what I'm proposing and what I'm hoping to emphasize here is that let's target the foundation. Let's target the understanding of the house so we can start dismantling the house modernity built through addressing these denials. So decomposition helps expose that fantasy of ontological separation, and decomposition and seeing it at different scales, both physically, material, and metaphorically, can help us recognize that this violent metabolism helps support these structures. So from here, I'm going to just pause because I'd like to open it up to get a sense for those who are more deeply embedded in authoring these papers and thinking through some of the fundamentals of the gesturing towards decolonial futures. I'd love to open it up to hear some perspectives, some reflections, some thoughts on decomposition and how it relates to the four denials and the house that modernity built. So I will mute myself, and feel free to self-nominate and jump on the mic.
I could jump on the mic for a sec. This is so rich. Thank you, Will. It's very, very provocative to understand violence as part of the ongoing energy that sustains the structure, and to understand that through a dissipative structure I'm thinking about separability as you walked us through as a fantasy that invites affective investment and embodiment, manifestation through embodiment and habits of being. I'm also thinking about the layers of the input of violence. And I guess I'm thinking through somatic abolitionism and thoughts around the way that trauma acts as a separability in time, that trauma is action interrupted, and that, that freeze. And I'm thinking about the way that freeze, I'm thinking about that in relationship to what you're, in relationship to two processes, I guess. The violence that sustains the dissipative structure, but maybe I'm also thinking about it in relationship to the video you showed us of the suspension of the input that allows an unraveling and an emergence. It's too new for me to know what I'm pointing to, but I guess maybe what I'm pointing to is pedagogically, I'm always interested in the afterwards. I think in pedagogy, we see what needs to be done, but really pedagogy happens in the attending to what unravels in the attempt, or what flows from the attempt at unraveling. And so the complexity of what happens in the aftermath of the destabilization of the fantasy of ontological security and separability. That is what I'm seeing as really multi-layered and goes in all sorts of directions and does its own digging up and has its own archaeology and its own. It works in a way that maybe only complexity theory could capture. I'm just going to offer that.
Mm-hmm. Thanks, Lisa. I really like that perspective. And too, this is really offering an opportunity to destabilize beliefs and worldviews around these ontological fantasies. And as you pointed out, there's a lot of work to do after that destabilizing. And they're saying that your pedagogical practice is around, okay, once we have an intellectual agreement around these fantasies, what's next? So I appreciate that point there. Others?
Oh, there's Rene pointing his hand out.
Okay, I can't really see. I'm gonna stop sharing.
Yeah, thank you, Terry. Actually, just have a question. Basically, like we were talking a lot about decomposition, but it's mostly of organic matter. And I'm just thinking about this foundation of modernity. Well, what if this foundation is not of the organic kind, right? So if I imagine it as a concrete structure, so sure, concrete is something you can break up with a jackhammer, but that's not decomposing it. I'm just wondering what kind of a thing would decompose that kind of a foundation.
Renee, it's like we planned this. That's the second half of the presentation. Is that question, but coming back to it though, is that, because I think that's where we're gesturing towards that affective composing. So the house that modernity built is both metaphorical and real in its violences, but it's a metaphor for an intellectual affective system as well. So we can talk about decomposition in terms of material beings and material entities in a way, but what I think we're at the edge of is then what does that look like from the affective sense? How do we compost and make that generative? Yeah, that's kind of like the first part was looking at the material metaphor, or the material process as a metaphor, that we're going to then tip into the affective part.
I think too, like, sorry, if I can go, that we're seeing now these cracks in the foundation of modernity in the current moment. It's almost like as teachers or we don't have to, I mean, we do have to kind of contextualize and help people make sense of what's happening, but they already see that the cracks are there. While some people are still in denial, some people are in like partial denial, some people are starting to see the full extent of the thing. And it's almost like we have to, like the imperative is for us to compost those intellectual and affective and relational problematic patterns, like in a race to do it before the house cracks or as the house is cracking, because if we don't do it before it really tumbles down, then this is the moment when I fear that, you know, all those fears and insecurities and harmful desires then get, you know, out in their full force because we haven't done any of that work. And then the thing comes crashing down on us and we panic and basically have like mass violence, even more than we already have right now, mass violence. So there's something interesting about the current moment, providing these openings and these imperatives for us to act. And also then the tension between feeling like it's really urgent, but then also feeling like, well, you can't rush this pedagogical process. But then in the meantime, while we're being patient, waiting for us and others to do this composting work, you know, terrible things are happening. And how to kind of balance all of those things is like something that, well, keeps me up at night. Mm-hmm. In a good way, often in a generative way, but yeah.
Before others, I hope others have something, but I just want to flag that coming back into the next part, so we've been talking about decomposition. We actually haven't talked about composting yet. And what's good is that part of what separates decomposition from composting is that the type of composting we'll be talking about is the material composting, but also the metaphor I think we're extending is that the process creates the conditions for generative life, but if it's done improperly, it creates toxic, harmful conditions as well. So what you just identified is that if you don't compost properly, or if you just think, oh, we'll just throw all this shit together, you can create even more toxic outputs than you had it originally. So I think I really want to highlight there what you're saying, Sharon, is that doing this properly can hopefully lead us towards stability. But what we know that doing it improperly will likely lead to even more toxic shit. So flag that for later, and I'd love to hear other people's thoughts on this dissipative structure, fantasies of separation, etc.
Yeah, I just felt like coming back to René's question about what do we do with the concrete, because in a way I've seen certainly in the cities that when the concrete gets too old, you can see the weed that is basically sprouting, and it's uplifting this to like heavy blocks of concrete in a surprising way. And it just brought me to this other metaphor that we often work with, which is the process of creating a fertile ground from which another like just ecological and economical project can grow. And that process of bringing health to the soil is inspired by mycelium, right? And then the mycelium does decompose, but as well nourish and share information, and does like plenty other services at the same time. So that is very vital and dynamic process that I guess we'll have to do with our energy of decomposition. And just to add another layer, in fact, we call this process of creating a healthy soil in many ways. It goes hand in hand with calibration of relationships with cognition and effects and our relationality. So I'm just looking forward to sensing the connection between the decomposing potential and the calibration that we can try to learn how to do.
Mm-hmm. Thanks, Terry.
Hi. I just want to share some thoughts that I am having in this moment, that it's somewhat of a paradox or a more difficult position to be in when you have the cracks and the cracks are expanding, and it also pushes the separability perhaps more extended. It seems that under these conditions is the time that the violence becomes way on the surface level, and it's so apparent, and we can see it every day in the news. It's not it seems that this ontological discussion, it become on the skin level and in a very present way for most of us in different places that we are. At the same time, it creates this urgency of proximity and at least to get the separability to stop, because they are actually being created because of this. People don't understand each other and they don't feel each other. So in this level of affection, this is what it needs to be created under the most difficult circumstances. But it actually needs the cracks in order for something new to happen. So yeah, I'm just thinking and would like to share this moment so that others can proceed with the conversation.
Yeah, if
Thank you, Camila.
I can kind of go
Go ahead,
off.
Crystal. Mm-hmm.
I was going to go off a little what Camilla was saying at the very end about how you need the cracks for something to generate. And I was just kind of thinking about, like, from a feminist perspective a little bit, when you're talking about, like, you're talking about life and death and then regeneration, it also makes me think about kind of the process of pregnancy. And I'm interested to hear other people's reflections on this, because I think about, when we think about the conceptualizations of things like separability and autonomy, it really makes me think, for example, of, like, it's very important that the baby comes out. It's important that at some moment your bodies are separated physically from one another. And also when we think about autonomy, like from a feminist perspective, I'm thinking about the idea of bodily autonomy, that you can say no, you can think about that. But then I wonder, Will, sort of, and everyone else, like, how do we understand those perspectives of this sort of life and kind of this sort of separation? And maybe that's a very, like, anthropocentric, but I mean, like, all mammals have, you know, this moment of the, you know, it's different with fungus or something, but kind of the point is, I'm curious about how you understand this house of modernity and these ideas of separability and autonomy as something that is really fundamentally making it so that we do not understand the reality of our common humanity and acceptedness, and at the same time understanding that like, what is the place then of this idea of separability from maybe a feminist perspective, or something else in the way that you're conceptualizing the need for this change?
I can just quickly jump in, and then I'd love to hear others' perspectives. But for me, the cracks are necessary, as Camilla said, and what I think decomposition in these practices point us towards is that we can start chipping away at the foundation, which we know can help dismantle structures. But it's about understanding the limits of metaphors and the scale of metaphors and the applicability. So I wouldn't say that following the pathway towards understanding this and disinvesting from the fantasy of separation means that you can't actually use separation generatively in different areas of discourse. So what you described as, like, the feminist, that's, I think I wouldn't even call it a paradox. It's more about the scale, recognizing scale, boundary, and limitations of metaphors. And but at that fundamental level, when we think about connecting to a broader metabolism, how that fantasy of separability prevents us from seeing it. But then separability in other contexts, I think, is a very useful term and concept. And we can have them, they're commensurable. They can both be held within the same time. If that helps start kind of thinking around it. But I'd love to hear others' perspectives on it.
That's very helpful.
I'd like to jump in, having an architectural background, because we're using a house and foundation. And when something changes like that, a lot of our codes and other things are premised on slowing down the fall enough that people can survive it. So with earthquakes being one of the big things, and I'm not able or trying to even bring this into the beauty and depth that you've brought forward in composting, because concrete doesn't compost very easily. I mean, it's such a long process. However, that might happen. There's a piece of transitional dynamic planning that also needs to be taken into account through this whole process. That survival of more than us, all our relations, and also like there's just a huge piece of transitional planning in this. And I think that's all I wanted to say.
That's great. Thank you, Sharon. I really like when it kind of crosses these boundaries into our different domains of expertise. And it's something that I never thought about, but I think Sharon has pointed in her work to this idea that there are policies that slow down the cracks so that we can rebuild. And there, as you're highlighting, there are policies that can slow down the inevitable dismantling so that we can survive. And so our group can think about playing with those.
And there's actually a recognition that those cracks, like sometimes a roof comes in and it's everything underneath it is totally destroyed. Other times it's slow enough that the engineering has slowed it down sufficiently that people know what's happening. There are signs that show, and they're made so that they show, and there's enough understanding in the population that they get out. And that's such a mechanistic thing, because the buildings that I'm speaking of are mechanistic, but going back to some more natural process and making sure your context is large enough when you think of it, and the invisibilities are brought in from other perspectives. It's a huge piece of doing this well.
Mm-hmm. I think you've also pointed towards, oh, go ahead. Yeah.
I think to follow Sharon, this also really raises questions about sort of the imagery of the metaphor as well that we choose to work with, and some of the limitations of using a metaphor like a house, which is something that individual bodies or collective bodies can enter and leave and sort of move around in a kind of spatialized way, which would sort of suggest or allow us to believe that modernity is something we can step in and out of, or that there are sort of places that are outside of it, entirely. And so I think we've thought before about, are there other metaphors we can use that problematize that a bit? But I think the return to the body here is really important, because I know in some of the things we write, for example, we sort of work at the very, very systemic level, very abstractly, or we work at the very, very organic level, literally with the earth. And there's a lot missing about, what you sort of implied about the scale of the human body, which is, yes, a manifestation of energy and the only medium we have right now, which relies on communication structures, which relies on representation to an extent, which relies on sensation and all of those sorts of things. So I think bringing that back in, I'm really pleased that's being brought back in. It's really helpful.
Right. I completely agree with Sarah, and this whole discussion is just really blowing my mind. So thank you, everyone. I started vermicomposting a couple years ago, and it's really changed my understanding of the world. So this has been really amazing. But this conversation, it's been reminding me, especially in terms of talking about the concrete and how it doesn't compost easily, and the limits of a certain metaphor, and being careful that a metaphor doesn't become an ideology, right? Like this is the only box we have to think about, because there are larger scales at work that have nothing to do with human agency. So concrete, eventually erosion may take care of it, but that doesn't mean that we still don't have to deal with it on the basis of what we have created through human agency, and how we now need to interact with it, as in the cracks are showing in a house, which is something, the shelter that humans would need. There was also something that Lisa mentioned that really stuck with me, this notion of this desire for safety that may be attached to intergenerational trauma, like violence being the thing that feeds this this process, and how hard it is to come to terms with the fact that that safety, especially if you have experienced trauma, and I realize that has been in different populations, have experienced differently collectively, but the desire for that safety when you're holding on to all the violence that has come before, and how strong that is to hold on to the notion that this house is safe, this house is sound, or even if it isn't, it's the house that I know. And I think, for me, had I not been involved more with gardening and with composing, with looking at my little worms, I would have struggled a lot more with that notion that things need to end. And that's a hard sell sometimes, because we are so disconnected from the earth. Mm-hmm. So I don't know if I have a point with this, but I just wanted to put it out there. So thank you.
Thanks, Blanca. I think I always get excited when I hear about vermicomposters and their small obsessions. Yeah, I think you're pointing to that right idea that there's something in the metaphor and the process that, yes, it's not complete and full, but it does help address some of those issues. And looking at the violence it sustains, why I like seeing the house as a dissipative structure, like a structure that requires constant input, is that then we can start focusing our attention at times. Okay, so what is this input and what are the implications? And I think what Lisa and you have pointed out is that trauma is, if we're going to look at the inputs, we need to then start understanding trauma, intergenerational trauma, and how that informs our approach to who will be available to. So I think it helps direct our attention and focus our attention. I think any good metaphor should help us focus. And so I think that's why for me, the focus on the input that helps maintain that structure is that for me, bringing our attention to trauma and violence and those implications, and then giving us a better understanding of what we need to consider as we continue doing this work. Similar to what Sharon said about the, I think you're pointing towards the responsibilities of, if you are targeting the foundation of a structure, that the collapse of that structure is going to have a potential to have a huge human toll, like of suffering. What are your responsibilities as you're trying to push cracks? So a part of this presentation was saying that let's target the foundations of this structure. Well, then what responsibilities have I, what policies, what have I thought about to be responsible for that destruction? You can't just throw rocks at a glass house and then leave. So I think that's another part of, for me, what has been presented in my practice is that I've been throwing a lot of rocks, but I haven't been as prepared for the responsibility of the destruction. And then Sharon Stein also pointed to that as well. Like, what happens if it does collapse right away? Are we really, is that, like, careful what you wish for? So I think that's why I like this metaphor of the inputs, the structures, and then the eventual collapse that we think must happen. And then you pointed towards what are our policies in place to be responsible. I mean, this is really extending the metaphor to Eurocentric white supremacy levels, but there's elements of it that can help us think through our practices. I have a little bit more, and I do have a closing activity, but I don't want to suppress the discussion. So before we jump into composting, are there any thoughts, any other contributions folks would like to get out?
I'd like to just say that, if you take the roof down, it's what lands on your head. I don't know, so it may not be the piece that we have to pay the most attention to, but if the walls stand and the roof isn't coming down on your heads, sorry for being so literal, but at that point you're not in nearly as much trouble as, so it's a complex sequence. That's enough. Thank you so much for the engagement with the imagery.
Yeah. Thanks, Sharon. Tanya?
Unmuted. Thank you for saying this, that the ceiling and the roof falls, because I'm thinking here the house has all those components that are always in change, that have been always changing and decomposing. So that how do we decompose the different aspects of it? How do we decompose capitalism? How do we do the same with the that we so very clearly the bourgeois nation state, right? And make it, because we'll probably need a state or not, but how do we compost one that is more sustainable. How do you do the same with violence? I mean, so many areas that at the same time need to be, and that we can act. I'm saying this because I've been thinking I want to share this article with my students, and but I don't want them to think that the end of the world is near, because they're young and they're the future. So how do I make it into something that is really hopeful? And they do want the decomposing of many of those. So that's why I was thinking about, I can work with others on these kinds of sense. So that's what I wanted to say. Thank you, everybody, for your contributions.
Thanks, Tanya. Sharon Stein, do you want to follow up on that?
I appreciate your trying to navigate how to work with students too. But one of the things that students I work with have also told me, Tanya, is I'm tired of education that infantilizes me, because I can see that these things are falling down. So don't tell me that the world isn't ending, because I know that it is. At least, not the world overall, but the world as we know it. So what if instead we said, actually what we need to do is not provide like sort of hope in the continuity of these things and the promise that we may not be able to keep, but actually figure out how we can work together so that we can support students and ourselves to have the stamina and capacity to face the possibility that this thing is ending, to understand how we got here, and to do this composting work so that something else can regenerate in its place, but it may not be something we know yet. So it's sort of like what Dugaldheim says, hope beyond hope. It's not the hope in the continuity of this thing or any particular promise about what might be possible, but in the possibility that something else might be there. But in order to do that, we have to go through the composting process. So what kind of tools and practices do we need so that we can do that work together? And how do we also grow up so that we can be, the elder to guide them through that process? Because a lot of us, I speak for myself at least, did not have that kind of example of someone doing this aging in a healthy way. So how do we support others to do that and ourselves in this urgent time? And at the same time, recognizing that especially for those who are really already struggling with this, they can be also drowning in the shit. So there's also that's the responsibility piece too, because there's the responsibility to prepare people for this work. But if someone is already drowning in the shit, they're not going to be able to compost. So they need a life preserver, and also being able to identify who's ready for what is part of the responsibility. And if you can't then give them what they need, figure out who can. So it's a super complicated dance of trying to do all of these things. Yeah.
Can I say one tiny thing as well, which is just that to sort of pick up on that, is that there is will and there's desire and there's sort of motivation and there's capacity to do this. And just thinking about it at the moment in terms of what struggling means, just having sort of friends that are, on the ground in the US and elsewhere who are so broken at the moment and so exhausted by just trying to survive state violence and white supremacy. What does that mean on the ground for people in those contexts? It's just on my mind a lot.
Mm-hmm. And I think too that's something that aligns for me with the metaphor of composting and the metaphor of the house the maternity built, and not so metaphor of the reality of what's happening and us working with our students and figuring out how to go through this process for ourselves and for them, is that I also have a vermicompost bin and a garden that I try to do as much as I can in. And there are many days when I do work out there and then I feel oh my gosh, this is so much work, and wouldn't it just be so much easier if I threw this away and I bought all my food at the store, you know. And I have those days for sure. And then I also have those days in my teaching and in my, you know, scholarship where I'm, this is so hard. And so that's a helpful alignment for me to see that, okay, yes, I have had many of those days out in my garden, but I still do it because I know that it's important, you know, and same thing with the teaching. Like I have those days and I need to regroup, and then I move forward and I figure out how to do it. So, I mean, all of these metaphors just kind of point us to the fact that this stuff is super hard and it takes a lot of work, and we can very easily get so overwhelmed. But we, in part, strengthened by these types of conversations, we remind ourselves that they're important, and that we need to figure out how to sustain ourselves through this so that we can survive.
Thanks, Sassy. Okay, I'm gonna the tyranny of the slides. So I just want to because we've talked about decomposition, and I really want to talk about composting and distinguish between the two, because decomposition is always happening, always will happen. We are all going to decompose. Composting is a bit different. So I'm just going to share my screen again. I got my combs again. I will get rid of that. There we go. Okay. So decomposing versus composting. And so I'm going to be I'm going to be describing these processes, but what I'm interested in is what sticks for you when you hear some of the terms and some of the ways that we describe composting that is generative in these metaphors we've been playing with. Okay, so decomposition is the breakdown. So a dissipative structure, all structures will eventually decompose into different components and be reintegrated into metabolism. That's going to happen. It's undeniable. In some ways, as Tanya was saying, it's almost in a responsible way. Maybe we need to talk about death more often to youth in our classroom so they can recognize and stop denying that death is going to happen. That would have helped me when I was 18. I certainly thought I was never going to die. Now I know better. Composting is creating the ideal conditions. And that's what I really want to stress here, is that composting is about creating ideal conditions for the rapid decomposition of organic matter into a more stable and generative medium. So I'm going to be talking about aerobic, so composting that requires oxygen. There is anaerobic decomposition, which results in some of the most pleasurable, beautiful things in the world, like kimchi, sauerkraut, kombucha, yogurt. That's anaerobic, without oxygen decomposition. I'm only going to talk about, although I'd love to in the future talk about anaerobic decomposition, and that's magic, but today is just, we're going to focus on aerobic composition. And so it's about what are the conditions required for this rapid decomposition into a stable and generative medium. And so what we have here in this diagram is showing us that we need some brown or some carbon-rich material. We need some green. And if you saw that video that I sent out in the email, that process, the individual was talking about these ratios, the carbon-nitrogen ratios, the brown, the green. For me, coming back to growing up in a desert ecosystem, now being in a rainforest, the dry and the wet, we need these things to integrate. So we have brown and green that come to compost, but it's also about having water, having a certain level of moisture. Without moisture, composting doesn't happen. Decomposition can happen, and it's slower, but water is there for facilitating compost. Too much water actually prevents decomposition. Too much water prevents aerobic decomposition and leads us towards anaerobic. We need air, that's the oxygen part. We also need macro and microorganisms who help decompose the process. And so, it's a lovely video, but we're going to skip it. I'll send this out. Well, I get so attached to these slides. I'm so sorry. yeah, I take issue with the word rot, but yeah, it's true. So what I love about that is a few things that we're going to see in this next slide, is that it's about the ideal conditions, not perfect. Perfect should not be something we ever strive for, but creating these ideal conditions with our inputs. So we have carbon to nitrogen ratios. Brown's agree. So the balance of these ratios is really important. Too much carbon, nothing happens. Too much nitrogen, it starts smelling like human manure, and it's you're losing nitrogen, and you're creating the potential for some really nasty pathogens relative to humans. So it's about balance. It's about maintaining moisture levels, always having oxygen, particle size as well. So this is an interesting issue, I think, metaphorically, about the particle size of what we're asking people to compost. Can we expect intergenerational to help compost the affective issues related to intergenerational trauma? Like, how do we break that down into different components so that we can actually work through something that's much larger? The FBI, this is not pro, oh, it's that hashtag right now where you're like helping support law enforcement. Yeah. The FBI is one of my favorite acronyms. The kids like it. It's got some violent parts to it too, but it stands for the fungi, the bacteria, the community of decomposers, the fungi, the bacteria, and the invertebrates. So composting is really a community effort. And some of the, if you think of the fungi, bacteria, and invertebrates as some of the other than human species that are most reviled, hated, kind of like the yuck factor, the gross factor, they are central to this process, and we should celebrate and stop kind of being disgusted by them. Critical mass as well. Without a certain volume of organic matter to start with, this process really doesn't go as quickly. And so they kind of showed in that video, they started with a large volume, and that helps actually bring, that's part of the ideal conditions for aerobic composting. And the last was effort. In that video, you saw the effort, the maintenance, the pitchforking, and the watering. So there's effort involved in aerobic composting. Decomposition, not so much effort. It will happen. Actually, most of our effort is preventing ourselves from decomposing. If we stop that effort, we decompose. But composting is different. Composting requires effort. So those are some of the ideal conditions for creating a stable, just like this diagram, just to show that there's a heat generation part, because of what we're seeing here. We go from this compost pile on the left. We have certain types of, so mesophilic means like mid-range in terms of temperature organisms that drive the decomposition process. But at a certain amount of time, there's a thermophilic phase. Different types of thermophiles start engaging. And that's also when we start seeing interesting things around like pasteurization or killing of undesirable seeds, killing of human pathogens happen in a compost. So that's why we can take manure and compost it, and then be, to a certain extent, be certain that E. coli and other pathogens actually are destroyed in the process. And then it comes to this maturation phase where it becomes stable. And that's a really important part of composting, is recognizing that there's a process that leads to stability. And if you can't rush that process, but when it's done, you do have what often people call black gold, because of the value of what compost represents. So just kind of, I like this just to show that there's a time component, there's a temperature component, and different parts of the community are involved, but we get to this maturation phase. And then this comes back to the outputs of, so black gold, or the compost is one of the outputs. We have carbon dioxide, which we know then contributes to plant growth. We have heat, we have space. So drowning in uncomposted material would be horrible. We have to recognize that composting also frees up space in our lives, metaphorically and physically, so we can continue on as part of the generative process. Stable source of organic matter. If you're in the soil science field right now, organic matter is, well, it's always been the rock star, but it's getting a lot of attention. And so it's a really important part of what compost provides. Bioavailable nutrients. So not all nutrients are available to plants, but through composting, they become available, and free of human pathogens, which is pretty anthropocentric. But yeah, so I just wanted to get those out there. Those are the conditions. The difference between decomposing and composting is that composting is about creating conditions for ideal decomposition into a stable state. And so what I liked about the recent writing on opendemocracy.net, I hadn't seen it before, but it's that kind of bit of a cartography around the idea of compost. And Sachi already pointed a little bit towards it. So what I'm going to propose now is that in order to extend the metaphor from material composting to affective composting, we've already started describing some of the ideal conditions that we think are necessary to do this work. So that's that capacity for holding space without feeling overwhelmed or immobilized and wanting to be coddled or rescued. Owning up to one's complicity and implications and harm. So we recognize our relations and our entanglement. The maturity to face the work as individuals. The positive, narcissistic, hedonistic, and fixing compulsions. Othering our self-images and self-narratives. I think this is what Sachi was pointing to, that stamina. Like, oh, sometimes this work is really annoying and hard, but I'm going to keep on doing it because I know that it's for the better good. And then turning towards unlimited responsibility. So I think here's where I wanted to kind of stop talking. I do have one more activity that I think can lead us out. We still have probably take about no more than 10 minutes. But what we have been describing and what folks within the Gesturing Towards the Colonial Futures have been describing already, I think, are the ideal conditions for helping us compost our affective shit already. And this particular set of statements here, I think, is allowing us to think about what those ideal conditions might be. So that I am going to leave it at, I'll leave it at that for now. Just to think about, I'd like to, this is like the crowdsourcing of this metaphor, is from what you've experienced in this group and from other groups, what are some of the conditions that you've encountered that you think are necessary for us to then transition to composting affective shit? So I'm gonna mute myself and put it back to you all, thinking about those ideal conditions to speed up and create more stable processes or stable outputs. And if Esther is willing, in the chat, I see she talked about thinking about arrows can be helpful in this context. If Esther's willing, would you mind expanding upon that?
I'll just type here. I was like trying to type in. I think it'll be faster this way. I guess something I've been thinking about is like sexuality and the creative process, since I think that combines life and death together, in the sense of your, I guess, I mean, as like a symbolically speaking, it's a creative act when it comes to creative new life, but it involves two people kind of merging into each other. So that sense of self kind of dissipates, and that's part of the process. So I think if you think, like, I guess composting can kind of fit into that process as well as life's creative process, you know, and I think that kind of regeneration can be seen in that way. So when it comes to following your joy and your pleasure, I think that's very important. And you know, in a way, living in a culture that's super disembodied makes that kind of hard to do. And there's a lot of pain usually, I think, when you like start. But I think like those processes can be held together where you can learn how to be more joyful and more creative and imaginative, and also like hold the idea that we're not, like, our sense of self is fleeting at the same time, and kind of learn how to navigate both things.
Yeah. Thanks, Esther. Yeah, no, that's I think a perfect example of where else we can bring these metaphors, and then practices we can bring into these spaces. Careful, I'm not about educational spaces, but the idea of that dissolving of self, unity between two or more people, like that type of activity, and how that might be generated in this space as well. So thank you for bringing that up.
I've got something to offer, but I've spoken once already. Does anyone else maybe what I'll offer is, like, I'm drawing from what Satya was talking about, the frustration of, boy, this is so much work. And then I'm thinking back to that Marxist notion of commodity fetishism that allows in consumer societies, allows you to fetishize the object without seeing the labor that created it, or the laborers who created it. So invisibilize the work and the love that that is present in everything that we are in contact with, because we bought it with money. We don't see that. And then I'm thinking about the Buddhist notion of intimacy, and what intimacy, the kinds of feeling of intimacy that comes when you're seeing clearly and not separated by the illusions. And so, and that connects with what you're talking about, Esther, in terms of eros, I guess, is that that both affective and physical composting brings me into closer intimacy with what nourishes me, because I had exiled that intimacy by classifying it as shit or garbage. That's all my thoughts for now.
I was wondering if I could contribute, I guess, a question for this, because the dissolution of the self, a question this brings up for me is the care of the self a necessary precursor to this kind of dissolving movement that you're talking about? And this kind of stems from work I've been doing with, like, this so-called inner child, or these, like, multiple chronologies that, like, inform the self, or the so-called self, the multiple selves that we have in our bodies. And I think, like, really attending to the needs of this little being, like, who is inside me and informs my reactions to things, has been really, like, I've been taking some steps that have kind of created these openings, but in order to get to those openings, like, first acknowledging, like, this wounded tiny human inside of me, or person, seems to me to be, like, something that I had to do to be able to start, like, radiating outwards. So that is kind of a question I want to pose to the group, because I'm really interested in hearing what people might have to say about that.
Quinn, it's funny because when we were doing the exercise, the Shavasana, there was a moment where, Will was asking us to imagine ourselves, the dissolving of the self, right? And what came to mind for me was I imagined, like, the microbes and all these little critters saying, "Come back to us," but it was addressed to a plural, you, all of you, come back to us. So I think, and I'm completely with you that it's taking a lot of time in talking to inner child, doing all these things to understand my own process of intergenerational trauma. And so allowing certain illusions of self to dissolve can also be very liberating, so that others can, and I don't know if they're all illusions, to some extent we can say that they all are, but realizing that the self that we talk about is also a pluralistic self, and that's a physical reality, and it's also okay to think of yourself like that, of we, we Blanca are hungry, we Blanca are digesting, you know, and that's millions and millions and billions of little microorganisms that I just happen to be the carrier for. I don't know if that helps at all, but I've been thinking about those kinds of things as well.
And I also think that thinking of yourself as part of a larger ecosystem can help reframe self-care as community care, and that they're not so different necessarily, that sometimes community care takes the form of taking care of yourself, and then sometimes taking care of yourself means necessarily taking care of your community. And I don't just mean like your neighborhood, but global, that all the communities that you're a part of.
Anita, you have your hand up?
Hi, yeah, thank you for these exercises, Will, and I also want to express my appreciation for the discussion that's been happening. I've been thinking a lot about this question about how do we create the conditions to compost all of this crap, and yeah, I don't have an answer to it, but it's just sort of, I guess I've been thinking specifically about a student group that I've been working with they have wanted to come together to sort of explore the impact of intergenerational trauma and how, like, decolonization from a South Asian perspective. And at one point I had to stop the process because well, actually, it hadn't even begun, really. It was like students individually coming to me and asking for a space to be created on campus where they could process all of this. But some of the students were in a place where they were just feeling so much anger and hatred. And they were saying to me that they hate this particular group of people and they don't know if they can sit in the same room with them to discuss, stuff that's so like stuff that's really impacting them and their families back home. And sorry if I'm like rambling here. I'm just trying to think through, I guess, really what is a way that I can actually take this tool and use it with this group of students. And some of the discussions we've been having is that, like the feelings of rage and even shame that come up, like instead of trying to create spaces where we can't feel that, how do we effectively compost that? And move forward together in this discussion that really needs to happen. And so, yeah, that's something I'm thinking about a lot for this year because the project has come up again. And I think right now the students are in a place where we actually can come together and have some of these really difficult discussions and, explore these notions of how we see each other separate from each other. But like how we're sharing this story of colonization and decolonization, but at the same time, we're seeing each other separately and enacting all sorts of violence on each other. And I'm also thinking about the house and how there's, there may be people who are in the house, there may be people who are outside of the house, and then there are people who are seeing that the house is crumbling, but they're also enacting a lot of violence on others to actually get to that house and get into that house, right? They don't want to give up on that fantasy. But thank you for this. This has given me, so much to think about and sort of try to apply to a very specific situation.
Thank you, Panita.
No.
Go ahead.
There were a lot of things that came to me with this metaphor and many things around. I've managed a community garden and community composting, and there is many things around, and there were concrete things and history that were coming to me of like when we're trying to compost together and when you're having people trying to literally compost together, there's a whole care and in the video it seemed like even simple, and there's, I think, as much care into composting that there is into gardening. You have to look into it every day, and you have to have an equilibrium in what are the inputs that are coming into the collective composting. If it's only the same things, and if people are literally bringing their shit into the compost, there is really a big impact in the collective composting, and also like this coming from this lens of the field of innovation, where it's always solution driven, and it's always about gardening and wanting ideas to flourish, and never wanting to have this time of composting and really looking at the entanglement underneath this gardening, and what is really needed to be processed underneath that. And also in this process of composting, there's, I think, a kind of rhythm. There's a dance, and it was in the video of like, there are some poses to take in the process of reshaking everything, and to also, there are times where your compost bin needs to be in a sleeping period because the equilibrium is all messed up into it. So yeah, I'm really thankful for all the layers that are coming to me with this analogy of composting, and how it helps bridging many things together with these practices, and the invitation also to, with the aspect of decomposition, of I kind of received the invitation of seeing like, what if I'm really already decomposing, and seeing aging differently, and this to me spoke of this kind of aversion of aging, and this aversion of loss and ableism, and seeing ourselves as the modern story of the path of life, of like, you have different steps, but we're actually just a tomato that rots in such a longer period of time, and that helps us imagine that we're so different and so separate. So yeah, really thankful for all these layers.
Thanks, Stephen. I know Sharon had to comment, but I really what you pointed out to there is an interesting condition, is that if we keep on bringing the same shit into the compost process, it doesn't work. So like and I don't know how to extend this to examples of the same shit effectively, but there is this part of composting is balance, and recognizing different shit is different and necessary. And I think that's what our group needs to think about, is what do we do? And it touched a little bit of what Panita was talking about, this hate and the rage. If we bring hate and rage shit all the time, what other shit do we need to bring in to help offset and then generatively metabolize that shit? One thing I love, I mean, at a certain point we have to stop calling it shit because it has this negative connotation. Well, it depends. I don't think shit. Okay, so we have to recognize that the balance is necessary, but too much of one thing leads to stagnation in the process and can lead to more harmful toxic outputs. So Stephen was pointing out that if you keep on bringing, like, I was working with a group who kept on bringing fish, just like fish heads and fish guts, into a pile, and they're saying, if the compost isn't doing anything, it's like, well, because you were just putting the same shit in, we have to find other shit to put in. And then once we did, we found noodles. It's a strange story. The shit started going, the noodle shit and the fish shit was a perfect match, and the beautiful compost came out. But it took us a while to figure out that balance. I could talk forever about composting. You've got me going. So Kristen, you've got your hand up. I'll pass it over.
Yeah, so as you know, Will, I also live with someone who can talk about composting forever, right? So because I live with someone who really loves composting and kind of experiments with composting in different ways, I kind of get the notion that it's not about creating the ideal conditions or like the linear process, but more about the joy of the process, and that you're never really done. And it's about the continuous experimenting. But then also what I struggle with this metaphor when I try to take it like crack it down to something in my own work is that it's also, at least in kind of the society and system where we live in Norway, doing composting is also a privilege. It's something that you can do because you have the time and you have the garden space to do it. And it's something that, and kind of the joy that comes with it also is something that you have the privilege to do. And not everyone has that privilege. And this is what I struggle with when I try to transfer this into my work. Right now I'm working a lot with anti-racism in my teaching and my research, and some people just don't have the privilege to do the composting, or they and something else that you also need with this composting is patience and time. And some people just don't have that because they're already drowning, as Sharon said earlier. And I guess this is also related to what Punita talked about with like the classroom or the whatever space and community of people you have. You will have people that are positioned very differently towards this task. So this is what I struggle with, that I feel that it's something I can engage in because I'm privileged to do that. I have the time maybe and the patience. Yeah.
Thank you, Kristen. Say hi to Fritjof for us. It's true. It's recognizing. I think those are the conditions that you've identified. Some of the overarching conditions that we need to consider as we're working through this metaphor. I would like to say too. So we're almost about time. I do have a closing activity that I think is a nice complement. If you're going to, and I do encourage you responsibly to talk about death in your with your students or with other people, and do the Shavasana activity and consider the decomposition of our material selves. I have one more activity. It'll take about 5 minutes that can help us towards moving towards and a bit beyond the material composting towards affect and the spiritual dimensions of our eventual passing. So if you have to go, it's been 2 hours already. I really appreciate everyone's thoughts and attention. But if you can stay for a bit longer, I'd love to walk you through one more activity that I think would be helpful to use in this realm of talking about our own death and transfer. But I don't want to suppress the conversation again at this moment. So leave it open. I'll stop talking for a few seconds. Final thoughts, please offer them out, and then we can transfer into this other. Thanks, Lisa. All right, I'm going to quickly share my screen. So as the social cartographies are quite common in this group, I did come across this infographic about, so you want composting from a material perspective. I think we do have the beginnings of an opportunity to think about creating a cartography says around the affective rather than material shit. So that's something for the future. I think that's where we might be leaning towards, but we'll take a lot of attention to what these boxes and arrows and questions could be to effectively compost your affective shit. But before that, so this closing activity that I'd like to offer and work through is straight from Resmaa Menakem's wonderful book. A few people have taken his courses. Highly, I think Quinn talked a little bit about kind of his articulation of clean pain and dirty pain, and how metabolizing pain and trauma in different ways leads us to different processes. And so part of the book about clean and part of this book does talk about what we've been discussing, is that how do you metabolize pain and trauma. And so I highly recommend this book, but I'd like to walk you through an activity in it that is an invitation, inviting the presence of your ancestor, and it's an activity on page 53. So I'll read the activity to you, and it take about 5 minutes. and use it as kind of a closing towards the initial invitation to consider the material decomposition, your material passing. And this is possibly an activity that looks and gestures towards the ongoing continuation of who you are and yourself. So I'm going to read directly from the book. As usual, it's kind of take a few deep breaths, get comfortable. This one is for a seating position. You could also do it lying down. So if you have a chance to get comfortable and kind of settle into this activity, and it'll take about 5 minutes. So as Resma writes, go to a quiet, comfortable place where you can be alone for about 5 to 10 minutes. Sit down, take a few deep breaths and some slow breaths. Feel free to either close your eyes or leave them open. So try to connect to your breath as I'm reading out this next part. So you're about to invite the presence of an ancestor. You don't know who this will be. You also don't know how how they will appear. As an image, a memory, a sensation in your body, an emotion, or a flow of energy. All you know is that this person lived at least 3 generations ago. 3 generations before you and died before you were born. They might be a great-grandparent or an ancestor from the distant past. You do not get to choose who this person is. He, she, or they will choose you. So sit quietly, following your breathing, and invite this unknown person into your presence. Don't plan to converse or interact with this ancestor. Don't try to identify or figure out anything about them. Simply observe this person's presence and notice how your body responds. If your ancestor doesn't appear quickly, that's fine. Just continue sitting and breathing. Give the person up to 5 minutes to make an appearance. If he or she appears as an image, what do they look like? How old do they appear to be? What are they wearing? What expressions on their face? Does your ancestor seem safe and settled, happy, fearful, distressed? If your ancestor is moving, what is he or she doing? What are they doing? Is the person alone or with a companion? Whether your ancestor appears in an image or in some other form, how does your body experience their presence? Does your body feel comforted, welcomed, loved, relaxed, wary, afraid, constricted? Does your body want to move toward or away from your ancestor? Does your body want to touch or hold the person or push them away? So we'll take about 5 minutes to consider and invite the presence of an ancestor. And I'll put the timer on for about 5 minutes. And then when we're ready, we'll thank our ancestors for visiting. We'll go from there. So when you're ready, thank your ancestor for visiting you. If at any time, though, if your ancestor's presence feels threatening, gently but firmly send them away. Then take a few slow, deep breaths to return yourself to the here and now. Orient yourself to the room by slowly looking around, especially behind you. If you still feel, oh goodness. If you still feel an uncomfortable presence, recommend to leave the room and come back. I like this activity as a nice way of acknowledging not only our material passing, but that we ourselves, we are our future ancestors. And so we will be back, we'll be visiting, we'll be engaging still. So not to perpetuate the idea of separability and that what we currently see as death as the end, but just a transition. Just like our material bodies will be transitioning back into the broader metabolism, our spiritual bodies will also be returning back into a metabolism. So thank you so much, everyone, for joining us for today's conversation and contributing in your thoughts. And Teresa is taking notes, and we're going to copy links that have been sent into in the chat, and we'll document them, archive them, and have it available to send around. Again, I really appreciate your time and attention and willingness to talk about these at times difficult issues, but also for me reinforcing the pleasure and the joy of also engaging with this type of material. So thank you so much, and really look forward to our next session in about a month. And yeah, hope everyone stays well.
Thank you.
Mm.